Executive Suite with WPRI.com reporter Ted Nesi.
Welcome to Executive Suite. I'm Ted Nesi. A relief to be talking about something other than politics here, 2 weeks or less than 2 weeks out from the election. So we're going to talk about the economy today. I'm very excited to have a guest who's been in Rhode Island before, and he's back today to speak with my two guests. Let me introduce them. We have Rob Atkinson. He's the president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. Rob, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Ted.
And with him, Laurie White, familiar face on the program from the Greater Providence Chamber of Commerce. Laurie, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having us.
And Laurie is the reason Rob is here, because the Chamber has him here from an event, and we're going to talk about that. But before we start, I want to remind people your foundation is in Washington right now,
right.
This one. But you have passed in Rhode Island. Can you tell people, remind them if they weren't here for that, why?
Yeah, no, I had
here?
the real honor to be the first director of the Rhode Island Economic Policy Council, which was an institution set up in the mid-90s, working with government and the private sector to set out a course and a vision for how Rhode Island could renew its economy, and I did that for a number of years and had a great time with it.
And tell me just a little bit so people know where you're coming from. What does your foundation work on? Sort of what are its priorities? What sort of research do you do?
So we're a think tank, and we advise governments at the state level, the national level, all around the world on how to grow and have innovative and thriving economies through technology, through innovation. What are the things you should do? What are the things you shouldn't do?
What sort of people do you have clients? Do the governments hire you, or do you put it out as public research and then they can read it?
We put it out and we hope that they consume it. So we don't really have clients, but we've worked a lot, for example, with the Obama administration on a number of initiatives that they've launched that have more or less have been incubated in our shop. Work with both sides of the aisle in Congress. A lot of governors take our advice or ideas and try to put them into practice.
But you did not build the healthcare website, right?
No, we wrote about why it failed.
There you go. Why did it fail? Long story.
Well, it largely failed because the government IT procurement process is broken. That's why it failed.
Interesting, the way they get those.
The way they get it.
That's probably a whole half-hour conversation
that's a whole half
in
hour,
itself.
yeah.
And Laurie, before we get into why Rob's here and what he's going to talk about, can you tell us a little bit about the event he's speaking at, and then why Rob was the right keynote speaker for it?
We have our annual Knowledge Economy Town Hall meeting, so we take stock of where the metrics are year after year after year. Are we making progress on the key indicators? And Rob says he hopes people consume his new economy index. So we're a prime example of an organization that follows what he has to say and what the metrics are leading to. So that's why we invited him up, because Rhode Island has made some important gains over the last 2 years. We've gone from 23 to 19, so that's very positive in terms of being able to turn the corner on being a technology state. And because he knows Rhode Island, we thought he'd have some important insights to share on what exactly went into those rankings, and more importantly, what do we need to do going forward to move faster and more meaningful.
And you pulled the question right out of my mouth as a fellow debate moderator this season, Laurie. I know you're good at that. Rob, tell Laurie, so we're 19th in Rhode Island now, up from 23rd. What does that mean? We're being ranked 19th. How are you measuring that? And what does it tell us about Rhode Island's economy today?
So we have a report we've done for a long, long time called the State New Economy Index, and it ranks all 50 states on things like how much venture capital do you have invested in your state, how many knowledge workers do you have, how many new businesses are starting, a whole wide array of those with 25 variables. So what it really measures is how well state economies are positioned to do well in the future. Doesn't measure how well you're doing now, but it says, do you have the kind of ingredients you need to cook it all together and make a really vibrant economy? So, Rhode Island's not number one. The state that's number one is 20 miles from here. Massachusetts, number one every year.
It always is.
Great innovation state. But also that adds some opportunities for Rhode Island to build synergies with Massachusetts. But Rhode Island, is 19th or 20th, I guess, 19th, 20th, in that range. That's not bad. It's something to work on. It's something to build off, I should say. So there's some strengths here. For example, Rhode Island is 7th in venture capital in the country. Third, actually, in what we call public R&D. So this is research and development that's not funded by industry, but hospitals, the federal laboratories, the universities. So
that's federal and state public funding for research?
For research and development. So there's some assets there. Interesting study just came out about a week ago. Rhode Island Providence region ranks second in the growth of college-educated workers.
I wrote that story myself.
Right. So there's some real, so the nice kind of pieces of the puzzle. Knowledge workers, R&D, investment capital. It's really about putting those pieces together to build the next economy.
Now, Massachusetts first, Rhode Island 19th or 20th. Who's last?
Well, it's always a toss-up between Mississippi and Arkansas and West Virginia.
What really hurts, I mean, obviously some of those places have reputations in different ways, but what really hurts them in your rankings that keeps them at the bottom of the barrel?
So those states historically, for the longest time, really since the 20s or even longer, they thought the key to economic success was just have the lowest possible cost ever. You don't need good schools, you don't need investment in innovation, just keep those costs really, really low. You'll attract factories from the north, everything will be great. And you know what, that worked pretty well for those states. They were catching up on income until about the mid-90s, then it all collapsed because if you're a low-cost producer, you're not going to Mississippi, you're going to Mexico, you're going to China. So the low-cost strategy that they're still struggling to kind of come out from is a real barrier to them. So, you know, not to knock the South, but there's some good universities there, but name some, you know, top-ranked universities in the country. They're in New England, they're in the Mideast, Pennsylvania, New York, California. So that's part of the problem. And to their credit, a lot of Southern governors and legislators understand that. They've got to work on innovation. They have to have some public investment to do that. But it's a long road.
Long haul.
Yeah.
Laurie, you know, I can imagine some people at home saying, well, wait a sec, I think the chamber doesn't want high costs in Rhode Island, you know, maybe they'd prefer more of a southern flavored, you know, low wage economy or something like that. You know, when you hear Rob saying that, how do you view that as a business community which doesn't want the highest taxes in the land necessarily, but also does see some role perhaps for that?
The key is to be competitive. You don't want to be a super outlier on taxation, as an example. You want to be in the middle of the pack, and you want to make sure that the public dollars are invested in the right places, like public higher education. So I think that that's where Rhode Island and all of the states in the Northeast have a real competitive advantage, because we do have great institutions of higher ed. But for a long time, our tax structure, I would call it a lazy tax structure, in that the tax rates, in some ways, you could see that they were backed into. Okay, we need to plug a budget hole. What are we going to do to fill the gap? Okay, we'll just, you know, we'll raise it here, we'll do it here, we'll do it here, and it wasn't thought out in a way that would understand what kind of dynamics that would create. So I think right now, over the last several years, there's been a lot more study and a lot more thought going into, and just purposeful activity around having a very competitive tax structure, so that we're not the worst and we're not the best.
You know, I know sometimes when an outside company is looking at Rhode Island, they'll bring them to the chamber or some of your bigger members and ask them to discuss. I mean, does that resonate? The idea that, you know, you'll get more, you're paying more in Rhode Island, but you'll get more, or do you find a lot of times it's, they just look at that bottom line?
As a matter of fact, workforce issues are now at the top of the heap in terms of the rankings, what site selectors and corporate location consultants are looking at. What is the quality of your workforce? That's why the quality of the schools, both from a K-12 and a higher ed perspective, is so very important today. Because if you don't have the workforce, then you're not going to be able to compete and succeed and win.
Does that fit with what you hear, Rob, when you go around the country?
Yeah,
and you
I
talk
mean,
to
really what
leaders?
you want, and it's the sort of utopian world of economic development, you want low business costs and high public investment.
which is it's nice to say, but
nice to say, hard to do, because their intention. But look, you know, there are things that Rhode Island has been sort of struggling with or burdened with. For example, high pension costs. That's just a total dead weight loss. You could have taken those pension savings, put them in public investment. You could have taken those savings, put it into tax cuts for the businesses aren't burdened. So it's those sorts of things you don't want to have as a state. But you know, I think the sweet spot is sort of trying to find that place in the middle. And that's why I think things like having education reform here is so important, pension reform, continuing pension reform, continuing to make government work effectively. Because that's another thing companies look for. You know, they look for a highly skilled workforce, but you can't be the outlier on the other things. You know, you could be a highly skilled workforce, but if you're number one on unemployment insurance taxes, you're off the list.
Which Rhode Island is at the moment. I've seen those ring. I know you've looked at that too, Laurie.
That'll be our next challenge.
The next one, all right, I'm going to ask you more about that a little bit. Before we go to a break, I do want to ask you, I asked why those bottom ranked states are the worst. So I'm sure people here have some sense of it, but why does Massachusetts, what drives, beyond just, Harvard's there and, some Cambridge biotech companies, what's really driving that for Massachusetts right to the top of the list?
Harvard and Cambridge biotech companies.
Really?
And MIT.
MIT.
MIT
Look,
is
I think for Massachusetts, I don't want to overstate the role of policy in Massachusetts. The state's done some good things and all, but a lot of what Massachusetts has going for it is this historical legacy. They were the first venture capital company in the country. American Research and Development Corporation back in the 40s was in Boston. It all grew out of that sort of Yankee money. They needed to reinvest it somewhere, and they said, let's do that. MIT, arguably the best research, the best engineering school in the world. You can't, that's just, you can't top that. And then all of the rest of that, Harvard, the hospital system, and then the growth of biotech companies who begot more, and the IT, and so they just have a great sort of ecosystem that they've been able to build on. But at the same time, they've done good policies. They've tried to rein in business costs. They've tried to make sure that the public schools and the public universities are good. So, but it's just unlucky in a way that that the Massachusetts corridor, the high-tech corridor, was going northeast rather than southwest.
So some of the challenge for Rhode Island then is Massachusetts. This isn't stuff you can change in a year, a gubernatorial administration, even 2 terms of a governor. That is stuff that you're talking about the 40s for R&D. Harvard is in the 1600s. I mean, this is some long set in stone things.
Yeah, I don't think it's that long. You're right. It's not 1 term. Whoever gets elected governor, ideally, what the next governor will do is they will put in place the policies and the policy framework so that 6 to 8 to 10 years, those seedlings that are emerging now will really grow into young plants, if you will, start to become gazelle companies, start to grow. But yeah, no, it can take 10 years, but it's not 50 years. It's not 50 years.
I visited with the head of technology transfer at MIT a couple of months ago and asked specifically, what was the differential between Massey and Rhode Island, to your point. And she explained that MIT was set up originally with a public mission. What their public mission was to commercialize research. So they specifically were set up to help to create, and that's what ultimately created the Route 128 belt. So it was part of their DNA. It was part of their DNA. It was right in their charter that they exist to accelerate the advancement of science and engineering and turn them into companies and jobs.
All right, we're overdue for a break because I could just keep going, but let's take that commercial break. But you won't want to miss any more of this conversation. Stick with us on Executive Suite. We're going to talk much more about the knowledge economy and what Rhode Island can do about it. Stick with us on Executive Suite. Welcome back to Executive Suite. I'm Ted Nesi, and we're having a conversation today about the knowledge economy, and no one better to be a part of that conversation than Rob Atkinson. A time ago, he was head of the Rhode Island Economic Policy Council, so he knows the state, but he's now and has been for a while the president of a think tank in D.C. called the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, and he's joined by Laurie White, the president of the Greater Providence Chamber of Commerce, who has him here to speak at their knowledge economy town hall, it's called, right?
Right.
So I want to continue right where we were before. We were talking about why different states succeed and thrive in this. And before we keep going, Rob, can you define for the folks at home, I could imagine for some of them it's still fuzzy, knowledge economy, sometimes people want to call everything that because it sounds good, but yeah. What do you think of? What does it mean? Is it just computers? Is it just people writing software? Is it all biotech? What is it to you, knowledge economy?
It is definitely not just about software or even high-tech companies, if you will, product companies. Knowledge economy is essentially an economy where your competitive advantage is based upon the ability to produce high-value-added, complex things and keep doing new and better ones all the time. That really is what defines it. Most companies, most industries, they don't have to reinvent themselves every 5 years or else they die. And that's really true in the knowledge economy. And there's a lot of good studies that if companies aren't replacing 20% of their revenue every year with something new, the odds of them going out of business are very, very high. And that's really what the knowledge economy is. So the reason the knowledge economy has become more important is the commodity economy, the low-cost economy. It's a global economy now, and we've segmented that parts to places like China, places like India, places like Mexico. Our comparative advantage has got to be on the knowledge economy part. That's where we can do things they can't do, and that's where cost doesn't matter as much. It doesn't matter. Look at, for example, why is Silicon Valley so successful? Not because of cost. It's the very expensive place to do business. You got to pay your workers a lot. Housing costs are expensive because it's such a rich knowledge economy, and they can compete on that basis. So again, a place like Rhode Island, you don't, again, I think the central message is you can't ignore costs, but you also can't ignore building that knowledge base.
How much, though, is it is it hard to plan for or create that, in the sense that, we're talking, something sounds like about cluster effects. Silicon Valley, it doesn't matter almost how expensive housing gets in San Francisco, those companies are there and the workforce is there, so it builds, and the next company's there and they're there again, and it keeps going and it gets bigger. How much can a place like Rhode Island, that maybe wants to be on a somewhat different track than it is now, steer the ship of state and everything else in the direction that they want it to go, versus just it has to happen?
Yeah, so you've got two controls on a ship. One is forward, back, one is steering. You want to make sure that your controls are actually going forward. Not always the case in all states. And you want to be steering in the direction of knowledge rather than cost and commodity. You look at a place like Silicon Valley, why did it emerge? Well, it emerged partly because of leadership and policy. So Stanford's a good, Laurie talked about MIT. You look about the leaders of Stanford, they decided as a mission that they were going to build Stanford Research Park. They were going to integrate and work with industry and startups, and that core really built upon itself. So look, Rhode Island's not going to be Silicon Valley, because no one's going to be Silicon Valley. There are places all around the world that want to be that. They won't be. But Rhode Island has real strengths, and it's a question of how do you sort of build on those strengths and keep gradually and incrementally getting better.
You have written before that you think the loss of manufacturing jobs nationwide is a bigger reason for some of the economic troubles the nation has experienced in recent years, more than is maybe realized or discussed. Obviously, that's been a huge story in Rhode Island in particular. Can you give a brief version of that thesis, why you think that's been so central to what's happened?
Yeah, so one of the things that Washington policymakers and Washington economists frankly just have no clue about is this notion of what local economists, what the chamber understands in local economy, is the difference in an economy between the industries that serve the local population, the haircuts, the restaurants, the news shows, and the industries that export things out and bring money back in. So if you don't have those industries that are sending products out or services out and bringing money back in, you can't support the news shows, the haircuts, and the restaurants. So it's this notion of traded sector competitiveness. Manufacturing is the biggest part of the U.S. traded sector, and we lost a third of our manufacturing jobs in the 2000s. Rhode Island actually lost more, although what's interesting, they weren't the worst. North Carolina was even higher. So you can't have a vibrant economy without a vibrant traded competitive sector. In the U.S., simply, we've just ignored that at the national level. Both parties, to some extent, just say,
but there is a movement for advanced manufacturing coming back and the onshoring.
Well, yes, but I think that's overstated a tad.
Now she's your hostess. You can't go into
that. There you go. There's a new study came out today by Boston Consulting Group, which is arguing this, but we have another study will be coming out. If you look at overall U.S. manufacturing output in inflation-adjusted terms, it's lower today than it was in 2007. Lower at the end of 2013. So it's better than it was. There's no question it's better than it was. The competitive dynamics are better, but we haven't completely turned the corner, and we can't sort of just, let's sit back on our laurels and it'll all come back. We've got to work harder. We have the highest corporate tax rate in the world on manufacturers.
We, the U.S.
We, the U.S. I don't know about Rhode Island, but yeah.
Well, it's come down.
Rhode Island's corporate tax rate will, as of January, be the lowest in New England at 7%.
All right, we're going to take another break. When we come back, maybe some advice for the policy makers who are going to take office after the elections that are coming right up. So stick with us on Executive Suite. Welcome back to Executive Suite. I'm Ted Nesi, and we're talking about the knowledge economy. Could have filled an hour or two in this conversation, but this is our last segment, so we'll try to keep it succinct. Rob Atkinson from the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation and Laurie White from the Greater Providence Chamber of Commerce are my guests. So, Rob, you're going to be speaking to folks here today, but I'm curious, if those folks included the next governor and the future General Assembly leaders, what would be your big advice to them? They'll have a sense from this conversation already, but what would you say? Focus on this. Make this a priority in the new year to prepare Rhode Island for the future.
Well, look, it's a hard job, whoever is going to be the next leaders of the state. There's a lot of challenges. It's sort of the simplest way, it's like it's job stupid, remember from the Clinton. It's two things, I think. One is that you have to be relentless on business climate issues and business costs. You just, like unemployment issues, you got to be fixing that stuff. The second is you got to be thinking about institutional innovation. You have to be innovative. You have to have government be innovative. Like, for example, why aren't there really, really innovative charter schools in the state? Like other states are doing, science and math magnet high schools, new kinds of learning. You got to actually, as a government itself, do innovative things, because that's how the knowledge economy is going to get powered.
And Laurie, what's going to be, nice job on the succinctness there, what's going to be the big priorities for the Chamber of Commerce coming up in the new year? You'll be advocating more than advising up there on Smith Hill, but what will you be talking about?
Naturally, the nuts and bolts of the competitive business climate, that goes without saying, but public higher education, so CCRI, Rhode Island College, University of Rhode Island, key elements to the knowledge economy, and steering the ship towards investment in research and development and getting research out of the laboratories and into commercial enterprises. Very important on the K-12 side of things, rigor. Absolute, positively, must have rigor, adherence to the Common Core standards, high stakes testing. It only hurts students if they are not ready to compete when they graduate. When they're 17 and 18 years old, they'll never catch up. If they really have a graduation diploma, that isn't worth anything. So being assertive and being relentless on the importance of education, because it is the great equalizer.
All right, Rob, we have about 2 minutes left. I have to ask you one of my favorite quotes you ever gave in an interview with me a long time ago. You made a quip in a speech once. I know you know the one I mean. Can you repeat it and then contextualize it?
Well, I think the quip was, you can do one of two things as a state. You can go for a low-cost strategy with low quality, like many of the southern states have historically done, or you can recognize you have higher costs, but you got great quality. State like Massachusetts, state like Minnesota, state like Washington State. Problem is there are states in the middle, and I think Rhode Island's sort of one of those, where the quality's not good enough. Your quality should be higher and the cost should be lower. And that's really the challenge for Rhode Island, is you want to be working on both of those things at once. You can get that magic place where your cost structure is good and you're able to get good quality, good innovation, funding the higher education system, and you're making sure the K-12 system works, making sure the infrastructure is good. Then there's some real opportunity for success. But for the longest time, Rhode Island had this anchor chain. It's the motto of the state. This anchor chain, like for example the pension system, like for example all that sales tax that was going into paying off bank debt that could have been going into infrastructure. So that's a real big.
How much when you were in state government? About a minute left.
What was the quip?
Oh, it was you can be Minnesota where you have high costs but super good quality, or you can be Mississippi with low costs. But the problem for Rhode Island is you have the cost of Minnesota and the quality of Mississippi, which I think people didn't love. But that's
it's exaggerating the point. But I was trying to make the point about the direction. Okay, you want to have higher quality here. Look at the schools, for example. The school system needs to be better here. It's not a question of cost. The per pupil spending in Rhode Island is actually pretty high, but the outcomes are not anywhere near as good as you would expect for that.
So briefly, Rob, you were in state government when you were, and I know it was a time ago now, but was there anything fundamentally wrong with Rhode Island that other states don't have? People sometimes get that only in Rhode Island feeling, or did you see a state government that could be steered in the right direction with the right leadership and whatnot? 30 seconds.
The biggest thing that I think the challenge that Rhode Island had a little more than in New Jersey and some of the East Coast states, stronger unions who resist change. I think at the end of the day, that's one of the differentiators here. But it sounds to me like what's already happened, and what a lot of the candidates are talking about is, that there are real opportunities for big change, and we've seen some of that. It sounds like already.
I would say that the private sector unions in particular are very open to change, and we work closely with the building and construction trades because they know how important a positive economic development environment is, because it puts construction jobs in play.
All right, we'll leave on that hopeful note. I want to thank Rob Atkinson and Laurie White for joining me this week. If you missed any of this show or any episode, they're on WPRI.com. See you next week on Executive Suite.